So, I was looking at my cell phone, which you're not supposed to do when you're at the podium, because my last message to my significant other was, do you want me to stop off at the house and bring the cake that she baked last night? So, do we have any minutes now that she has a chance?
Thank you. And we start off our 2018-19 season with two gentlemen who got us off to a great start last year. Glenn Davis of Davis Architects in Hudson, who was involved with the many projects for Hudson's 150th celebration, and Richard Gelke, a member of our society and well known for many informative presentations on Hudson history, entertaining with his quick wit and delightful sense of humor. So please give a big welcome to these two gentlemen.
Keep it up, keep it up. Well, thank you. Okay, this is a continuation of what we did last year. Some of you may remember we did 4 architectural gems. We did 4 residences downtown, and we thought on that was reasonably successful, meaning nobody fell on the floor flat out. So we thought we'd try, what is this? What kind of a crowd is this? We thought that we would try it with some industrial buildings. There we are. And if we don't lose anybody tonight, we might continue this with like municipal buildings, maybe the town hall, armory, and some of the other ones. Sort of a little bit about the history and something about the background. Well, this is going to be a duet, as it was last time. There we are. Glenn is over here. I'm the second guy there. At any rate, getting right to it. Hudson has been known for a number of things. Industrial activity was very prominent in the early days. Shoes, always comes to mind shoes, but certainly not the only. Machine tools, smacks of LaPointes, and a number of other facilities. Woolen and worsted, we're going to be talking about that. Leather and tanning. The reason these 4 is the 4 buildings we're considering represent these 4 topics. And those are the places we're going to be talking about. LaPointe's up here on Tower Street. Well, I should say this is Main Street. Here is downtown, the river. I think most of you are familiar with the map of town. If not, you probably shouldn't be here. But at any rate, LaPointe's up on Tower Street. Downing Electric, which if you drive up and down Main Street, is very prominent. It's down behind the caboose. For 100 years almost, it carried ifolds on the tower. Some of you may remember that. LaRosee Plating with the old Jefts building, and then the Hudson Mill building, which is where the society is now located. And those are both on Broad Street. Is there anybody here who worked in any of those industries? Which one?
No, I work in the building now.
You work in the building now? Okay, anybody else? Oh, good, I can lie. Okay, really quick, just quick. This is the population of the town. And if you can't see, please move the chairs around. There's kind of room here in the middle, because there will be a test on this. So if you can't see, you're going to not do well. But at any rate, beginning back here, 1870, the town 1866, notice the increase. It is rather dramatic and linear, even more so than it has been in the last 40 or 50 years. And this was from 18 up through the Depression, and then the decline, World War II, and then the tremendous growth in town in the 1960s, which almost doubled, as did many, many communities. Yeah, that's the era. A couple of maps really quick. This is one of the very early maps of Marlborough, that town. This is the Assabet River. It's a little hard to tell, but that's the river, and we are right there. And downtown Marlborough is down here. A little later, just after turn of the century there, the 1800s, we are beginning to develop industry and settlement around the dam there. This road will become, it's 85. Yeah, Washington Street. Yep, now Route 85. And going a couple of decades later, a lot of activity here. Now, some of that is due to better mapping, but indeed there was a lot more activity here. Elizabeth Hill, we now Pope's Hill. Here is 85. We have a main street, which we didn't have before. 85 was the early road. There was no main street in the early days, just a cart path. And here's the County Atlas, 1875. This is a very interesting map because as we were talking, Glenn and I were talking, I think if you walked down Main Street in 1875, you'd have a pretty good idea of what it might look like now, because all the roads are essentially there, many of the buildings have changed, but you'd pretty much recognize where you were. And we want to zoom in. Okay, here is Main Street, here is Wood Square, the river, and let's see, Broad Street is right here. And we want to zoom in on this area because it shows two of the four buildings we're going to be talking about. The Jeffs Shoe right here and the Mill Building right here, which was not there in 1875, as you'll see a little bit later. So that's one of the places. Here is the other one. Love these bird's eye views. These were all hand sketches from very competent illustrators who went around, laid out the streets, and abstracted themselves back. This is as if you're up and over looking down at an angle. And, okay, just to orient you, Main Street, here. Wood Square is up here. Here's Broad Street. And finally, Pope's Hill, where there used to be a cross. I hear some sort of faint a cross. The cross is there, but the lights have long since gone out of commission. But we want to zoom in on this area, which is the intersection of Broad Street and Main Street. What's at that intersection now? Hudson Appliance. What was kitty corner to Hudson Appliance? Kitty corner before what is there now? Poplands. Some of you will remember that. So that's this area.
St. Michael's Church.
St. Michael's Church is, let's see, right here. Yeah, because Broad Street, if you go across Main, it becomes Manning. Okay, if you zoom in, we're going to zoom in on this. Whoops, sorry, wrong way. You may not recognize this very well. It's a little bit difficult, but this is Houghton Street. This is an incipient Broad Street, which doesn't show all that well, winter, summer, and the intersection is, it's going to be up here. But what we want to look at on this is that building there. Got a sense of where we are? The railroads might throw you off because there are no railroads there, but the remnants of it is now what? It's the rail trail. And actually, notice it's this one here, but notice we have another one which actually split off and then fed some of the industry back here. This large building here was a coal shed, and the tracks actually went right by it. Knight's fuel tanks are going to be up here. Okay, that building, this one here, is the first one we want to talk about. And it is, here's a little bit of the history of that building. It's very early. It's one of the really first buildings. I mean, 1864, that's Civil War. That was really very early. Unfortunately, we have some early pictures of that. It was started as a shoe factory and always stayed as a shoe factory up until 50 years ago when it completely changed use. So we have a couple of shoes and the LaRosee plating, and that lasted for quite a long time until last year or thereabouts, when there were issues of contamination raised. Fire department came in, condemned the building, and I think there were probably some tax issues there as well. But nevertheless, fortunately, before the building was off limits, Dave Bonazzoli and I had the good fortune to be able to get in and go through the building and take some pictures, which we'll show you here. But Jeffs, Lyman Jeffs, comes from New Hampshire, formed a partnership. He began the Broad Street building in Civil War, 1860s. He did very well because of the Civil War, the incredible demand for shoes. The one thing, if you do reading about Civil War soldiers and battles, they were always out of shoes. So no matter how many we could make, there was still more. He was a state rep, senator, president of the bank, and died just before the turn of the century. That's Lyman Jeffs, good-looking guy. And his tombstone is in the Main Street Cemetery. If you stand at about the caboose and look up at Main Street Cemetery, he's on the left-hand side, on the Hudson side, kind of on the hill. And that is his marble tombstone. Unfortunately, marble with acid rain, it tends to dissolve, so it's very difficult to read. But that,
Did he have a family?
he had quite a family, quite an extensive family.
Okay, so we're going to show you a view in a minute from today, but the angle is where that arrow is of this lithograph. So you can see over time it really hasn't changed all that much. We were speculating that this may have been housing for some of the factory workers or even some of the managers right next to the factory.
Okay, let me,
Yeah.
you can either take that,
Yeah. No, I'll
get closer.
get a little closer so you can hear me.
There you go. That-
So over the period that this factory is built, you can see that it really hasn't changed that much, this block of buildings. So I find it a really interesting building because if you really assess all the buildings in Hudson, the factories, this is really the closest one downtown that's a wood frame building. And it's really one of our last buildings. So it's pretty sad to see that, at some point it may have to be torn down, but that happens over time with wood frame buildings.
I'm going to give you this. You'll have
Sure.
to hold it. You'll have
Yep.
to almost chew on it.
Okay. This is an early view of the factory without the tower or a water tower that was there. But again, you can see the house behind it. The elements of this building are it's a very it's a precursor to wood stud framing that became popular after the Civil War, where they were able to build houses quickly with a set pattern of cutting studs, certain heights and things. This was probably a custom milled and cut wood frame building at the time. Here's a Sanborn map of 1894 showing the general configuration. There's at the top there's a 5,000-gallon water tank. And this is moving ahead to 1901. This is what it looked like, and the L.T. Jeffs name is still pretty prominent at that time. This is from Winter Street. One of the elements that you would see in a wood frame building like this are very repetitive elements, but you can see the expanse of the windows. They're triple windows framed right next to each other with not a lot of wall space between them, so they were maximizing as much sunlight as they could to get into the factory. This is just a back view. In a lot of cases, they would add on at various points, so this was an interesting vantage point showing what was probably an add-on to the original factory building. This is a great view that Dick took a couple of years ago inside. And one of the things that I want you to just keep in mind when we look at some of these buildings are the spans that were allowable just from a structural standpoint. Builders, and this was before, there were engineers back then, but this was before, realistically they could get large clear spans. If you compare this image with the space that we're in now, you'll notice we have no columns in here. The only way you could achieve back then a clear span like what the space we're in now is if you had trusses. So what they were trying to do is have layers of floors as wide open as they could, but they still had to have columns at a regular pattern. But these are great interior views showing the structure. It's actually a very light structure compared to what we'll see in other buildings. One of the things I'll point out to you. Yeah.
And this is all wood.
This is like heavy timber construction. The post itself that's supporting the timbers is fairly small compared to what we'll see in other buildings. But you can see the connections that they had where they tied them together in like a jigsaw puzzle to really lock the beams together so that they kind of fit into place with by gravity, and then they just stuck a few bolts in. So Dick asked me, are those the original structure? And I told him I think it hasn't been changed since the day it was built. So it's a very interesting building. Has very nice proportions with the windows on the outside.
Okay, the second building is, you may or may not know it by this name, now the Hudson Mill Building, or worsted building, worsted type of blanket on Broad Street, built by Henry Dyson. His dates, 58 to just about 100 years. Middle of the 1800s, the middle of the 19. Came from England, founded the factory originally at the dam. He was in the building where Robinson's Hardware is now, and that's been successively occupied by a lot of different companies. Then he moved to Broad Street just for the turn of the century, did a lot of business, especially up through the First World War, huge demand for wool. And by the 50s, 3 operations going. The main one is the Broad Street plant, the mohair plant on South Street, which went away when South Street Extension was pushed through in the 80s. And then some on Cherry Street. We'll talk about Cherry Street a little bit later. Died in the 50s, and then the business was sold. This is an interesting picture because this is the building that occupied the site of where the Hudson Mill Building is now. This is Broad Street, and Summer Street is going to be right about over here, intersecting that. So if you drove up Summer Street, stopped at Broad, looked straight across or drove straight across, you'd go right into this building. You probably can't see it, but in a clear photo, the railroad track is up there in the back. The interesting thing about this building is it burnt in July 4th, 1874. When was the big fire that destroyed downtown Hudson? 20 years, exactly 20 years later. to the day. Okay, there you go.
Okay. So this is a Sanborn map of 1909 showing what Dick had some interesting progressions of how the building had been added onto over time. And this was a great reference. So the first building here is 1900, and just 100 years ago this year, we have a 1918 addition that follows Broad Street, and that's a fairly prominent area that you would recognize the building right away. And then later in the late 30s and then in the late 40s, we have subsequent additions to that early 1900 building. This is from the Sanborn of 1929. For the most part, the building has been, the perimeter has been locked in place at that time. And as from the previous slide, there are a couple more additions going up towards Main Street and Hudson. This is an early image of what it looked like. This is a current view that we have. One of the things I just wanted to interject a couple of timelines here in addition to our local Hudson history. In construction, just prior to the Civil War, 1857 was the first elevator that was installed in a building. Elijah Otis invented what was called a safety elevator that had a brake. He even had a demonstration in New York where they cut the cable and the elevator went sliding down, but the brakes caught the elevator. So after that demonstration, the elevator was available for use, and subsequent to the Civil War in the 1870s, it took a while. It took really like another generation before steel started being used for the skeleton of buildings. So what we have here with the very first part of the building is well after that. So steel was used in Chicago and New York. And the first full steel skeleton building, which could go up multiple floors, more than 5 floors or 7 floors, 20 floors, making use of the elevator, was around 1890 in Chicago. So this building is still very much a mix of masonry on the outside with buttresses that you see along the facade on that 1918 edition. That's withstanding the forces of wood framing and any steel that might be pushing out on the outside wall. So that's very similar, a response that they had in Gothic times years ago, where they had to resist the forces that were of wind and just loads pushing out on the outside wall. There's the 1937 view.
It shows the buttresses.
And that's a close-up. I really like, in all these industrial buildings, I like the stepped buttresses. It was something they needed for structural reasons, but they found in these buildings a way of stepping at each floor. So it's really interesting structural way of showing how the building is built. The other thing that you'll see here too, this is an early view of the 1918 edition from the rail trail side. You'll see the spans here are a bit shorter, and they arch across to each of the piers. That was something that would have been done with early mill buildings. Even in the early 1800s, they used the arches and close pier spacing to span the spaces.
Oh, I added that in.
Okay. These were filters and beds that were used as part of the sanitation system.
Effluent disposal, we'll say. And if you hit it, and the river is just off to the bottom right. If you hit the next one, yeah. Okay. There is in the river coming out of this building, because this is really what started Hudson sewage, was this building. And all of the nasties that were dumped into the river that were objected to by those people downstream, those, whatever they call, the Stowe people, I guess, or whatever, the Gleasondale, that crowd. So they sued, and this is just after the turn of the century, 1901, 2, 3, 4, a lot of court cases on this stuff. And one of the things that was forced to do was to pipe this from the, it goes under Broad Street, in fact, standing on Broad Street looking downstream, and this pipe goes down to what is now West Ridge Development off Wheeler Road. Some of you know where that is. And there was a disposal facility there that's long since been abandoned. One of the things when West Ridge was developed was that they were required to clean that mess up. And that was part of the agreement. And that was around 2000. It was on the planning board then. So, okay, there you have the back.
This is just a close-up view from that early black and white photo. You can see in this building the arches, are closely spaced, framing over the windows. There's actually granite or stone for the sills. So those are some of the giveaways that this was a fairly early building where the spans weren't quite as great as we'll see in some of the other buildings.
What's in place of that now?
Actually, that was a view we took just a few weeks ago, or maybe a month ago. So,
Doesn't look familiar to me.
yeah, that's taken from the rail trail, looking back at the building.
The backside.
Yeah. One of the things I liked about this is almost like a Sanborn map. It's an insurance map, but it's rather than a plan, it's a section through the building. And one of the things I liked about it was it described in detail the uses of the building. Like at the top floor, it had sorting wool storage. They had a soap room, carding on the second floor. A machine shop was on the bottom. So I just found this drawing kind of an interesting description of how the building was used back in the 20s and 30s. These are some interior views. You can see this is the 1918 addition that goes along Broad Street. The spans are a bit shorter. They're closer to the LaRosee building that we saw that was wood framed. This was a view that I really liked. We're inside of the 1900 building, and you could see the arches that were probably had windows in them. But in 1938, when the addition was put north of this, that was blocked up except for a couple of passageways there. So this was at one point the open, windowed north facade of the building. And even here, for the 1900 building, there was a fair amount of detail that was put into the piers. There was like a column head that was put in, and then the arches were built up around it. And one of the things I mentioned about the arches is probably just over the turn of the century, when engineering got more complex and steel buildings were coming into use, and they started settling in on what they could use for spans for steel. Arches became, it no longer became really legal to use arches to span. You had to use steel for beams. And they had been used since Roman times, basically, to span across openings. But, so this is a remnant. You no longer see this where you would have masonry kind of resting just based on friction, spanning across openings. Nowadays, you'd have a steel or a wood heavy timber lintel spanning across.
Also, aqueduct.
The aqueducts, yeah, the Romans used them for that. And actually, way back when, they would have a Roman engineer and his family stand underneath an arch, and they'd get rid of the keyway support, and that's how the Romans ensured that all the arches worked, because you were only had granted one mistake, I guess, in your life.
So it's the compression of what's above it, forcing all of those to distribute the pressure down to the vertical.
Locks it down to the
Yeah.
piers.
This was a view. There's Mr. Gelbke at the basement. The one thing that was interesting, if you remember that section diagram, was the vertical span in the space here. This was the machine shop, and that was fairly high space there. This is a 1920s view of that same shop. You can see the belts all over the space. It was probably a pretty dangerous space to work in, but
Yeah, reading any of the early papers, people were always losing arms, fingers, if they were lucky, only that, from those belts. Okay, our third place is LaPointe, so that I think many of you know. This is the building that has been in the paper recently on Tower Street. I think most of you know where that is. It's all you need to do is in the morning follow the crowd to Dunkin' Donuts on the corner of Main Street, and it's up Tower Street. Okay, well, there's Joseph himself. Very interesting guy. Born in Canada, came down around turn of the century, formed the machine tool company, came to Hudson, and developed what was called a broaching machine. Not being in the mechanical arts, I had to go look that up. But a broaching machine essentially makes holes and cuts in steel or hard material, and special kinds of cuts. They could make square holes, which was very interesting. And LaPointe became really the leader in doing that for quite a few decades. But it turns out that LaPointe himself did not last that long. He established another company, the Universal Boring Machine Company, and the reason I mention that is that building is directly in front of, and you'll see pictures here in a minute. But he sold the company in 1911. John Prindiville, a name some of you may know from Framingham, then took over and lasted for decades, and his son got involved as well. Did a lot of work in World War II, lots of awards from the military, was particularly important in the automotive industry and also in armaments. And they were real leaders in that. And then by the 60s, the world changed in a lot of ways. Competition came up, and they closed in the 70s. So that's a bit of the background. This is one of their early advertisements. And we'll see a picture here in a moment. That is a very early broaching machine. I don't know if you can read it, but down here it says J.N. LaPointe Company, New London, Connecticut. He also had a facility in Connecticut, where he went later. But he was really, LaPointe is the one that really developed this whole notion of broaching machines and precision machining, which up to that time it was all pretty much by hand, hit or miss kind of thing. Henry Ford could not have made all of those automobiles without something like this. So they went hand in hand with this. Well, that was the original building. And if you drive up Tower Street, past the railroad abutment, you don't quite see that now, because what you see is the building in front of it. If we go back, you saw this building just a moment ago. And then very shortly, he put up that building, and that was the Universal Boring Machine. And that name may be familiar to you because they subsequently moved down to opposite Dunkin' Donuts in that building on the corner. Sandoz Chemicals, some of you perhaps remember back to that. That is next to it, totally unrelated to it, called the Tape. This was not the telephone company, this was New England Tape, and Delton Plastics came in the 30s, quite unrelated. So you put all those buildings together, and it might be confusing as to actually which was the LaPointe's building, but it was the original building that you saw. Here's another view of it, obviously from the tracks. Very interesting picture. This house is still here. And I think it's the Hudson Investing company. But typically, and we've done a lot of this work, typically in the old days, in a lot of our pictures, it's absolutely bare. You can see most everything. Everything was pretty cleared. I went back, oh God, tried to climb up, don't try to climb up onto that railroad grade. First of all, it's very steep. It's full of poison ivy and very unsatisfactory because the best I could do was that picture because it's all grown over. So at any rate, take it away, Glenn.
So we have the 1909 Sanborn map, and you can see already the Universal Boring Machine Company's built in front of the LaPointe machine shop. This is 1929, 20 years later. The LaPointe building is pretty well locked in along Tower Street.
And here's the railroad track.
Yeah. So the elements here, again, we see some arched openings, especially in the building in the foreground. You can see the multiple layers of brick arching over from one pier to the next. The one thing about the LaPointe building that's interesting is you see a transition that occurs, especially on the back side. On the top corner, I'll just use the pointer for a second.
Yep.
There was, in some of the early photos, this is shown as a tower. It looks like it was 3 stories high, and nowadays it's matching the adjacent parts of the building. So we speculated that at one point the tower was knocked down. There may have been some damage, and they just figured it was just easier to put a flat roof over the entire corner than kind of work with the tower that was there originally. And this is where we start to get into, again, like a transition from arched openings to the pilasters, where we have the multiple bays. And the thing that's interesting, I believe this was stone here, the sills. But then once you start to get to the pilasters for a later addition, the sills are all concrete poured. They must have had like a major order that they had to expand the building pretty quickly. So that was the way to do it at the time, was structurally was just to use piers and probably some steel inside and span across as wide as they could. And the spans here are wider than the ones that we see in some of the earlier buildings that we had presented.
That is very likely so because the big expansions happened during the war, Second World War, and they just had to, whatever they could do, as fast as they could do it.
This is the back side of the LaPointe building, and you can see now it's, again, pilasters just built on the outside, spanning with, at this point, to maximize the glass, they probably had steel just spanning across from one pier to the next so that they could have as much glass as possible. These were all venting windows that were fixed across there. So we're looking back down towards Main Street in this view, and they even had like a second tower there in the corner. This is again from the backside. You see the arches, probably from an earlier period of the LaPointe building, and then there's a transition where this occurred to large expanses of glass, just straightforward structure to maximize the amount of glass that they could get there. This is just a close-up detail, just showing, you know, side by side, essentially two different structural systems. Again, you can see the stone sills here. So that was someone probably hand chiseling the exact length to put at each window opening. And by the time they got here, this was someone who was just casting in wood the form, and they were just pouring it with concrete and moving on to the next bay. They would, you know, this person would take 2 weeks to get six of them done, you know, for 2 floors. This person was probably marching along, you know, getting 12 bays done in a day because they were just pouring concrete.
Okay. We, for maybe obvious reasons, were not able to get into that building. There's been a bit of a fuss. So, moving on. Our last building, what I call the I-folds, for many years. Do people remember that on the tower? Or some few years ago, John Downing bought it, now Downing Electric. But the building itself is interesting. I've been able to find out virtually very little about the early history of this, and it turns out that once the building was constructed, and I'm not sure who did that, but very early it was taken over by I-folds. Whether he built it or not, hard to tell, but I-folds is an English company, and the main plant is in England. And this was just a small branch plant. And let's see, up through the 60s, a number of things there. The thing that I'll mention in the 1960s, Larry Daly bought it out and created what was called Riverside Belting, essentially continued the business. It was a belting. They made belts for pulleys. You remember that picture before of the mill building with all of the belts and the pulleys? They made that, and they made it for all kinds of transmission. Encore Party Rentals came in around 2000. Robinson Rents was there. Riverside Belting sold to a Worcester firm. Believe it or not, the Worcester firm was called Hudson Belting. And then Downing Electric. 2 little tidbits. I couldn't resist this. One of them is, I am assured by Steve at Robinson's, because he worked in there, the place is haunted. Tells you more about Steve than the building. And there was a chimney, which you'll see in a moment. Right now there's only half a chimney, because around 2000, it got hit by lightning. Okay, the main plant's on the left in England, and I Googled and spent a lot of time and couldn't really find anything out about them. And the Hudson plant, which looks pretty good, it's on the right. This was from an ad. Tanners and couriers, well, tanning we know. What's a courier do? It's not UPS or FedEx. Yeah, I had to sort of look it up too. Dressing and finishing leather after it's been tanned. Curing. Okay, this was an early, World War II ad. They were there for a very long time. Nice picture, early picture, 1914 of the plant. And over on the far right, does anybody know who this is except for Tony? That building is still there. No, you would think it to be Light and Power.
It's a generator, isn't it?
Nope. Okay, Tony, tell him.
That was the original pump station that took the sewerage from the town and pumped it down to the filter bed yards on Cox Street.
And it's still there. If you drive down Cherry Street, you see the big Light and Power station, and then this is behind the chain link fence. It's not very obvious. But kind of a handsome building. Don't confuse this with Watt Aquatic plant, which was next door, that became the Taylor plant that is now the self-storage. That was next door. If we superimpose, no, it didn't work. This is the best I could do. But notice the tracks, and it was on the tracks. Actually, there was a spur track off of this main track. And if you had anything to do with Country Glass in the last couple of months, they just took up that track and created a lake when it rains. If you've seen that, it's unbelievable. But nevertheless, okay, so that's the plant now with the rail trail in the foreground. And here, I think it's up to you now. This is the rail trail here. Here's the caboose. And here's the spur track, which actually goes across Cherry Street to the to Layton Power, which of course needed huge machines and that kind of stuff. And serviced it. Okay, there you go. You're on.
This is one of the elements, again, in architecture that you can see that's fairly prominent here are the buttresses that are the piers that stick out off the wall of the building. And that was done, again, to provide some horizontal stability for maybe the loads that might be from a heavy wind pushing the framing back and forth. The buttresses would hold in place the wall, so the entire wall wouldn't have to be very thick. It's thick, but not as thick as the full buttresses in that wall. And it allows larger expanses of glass. This is a view heading up towards the entrance. Again, they spent a little bit of detail on it, but you can see in this case, when the iFolds building was built, they had concrete sills. Probably by this time they may have even had steel spanning across, and they could have used the arches either structurally or as a decoration at this point. I'd like to thank Doug Gold here for providing us some photos from a few years ago from the Assabet River Bike Shop. We had some interior photos that he gave us, so this is a great view of the original windows that were there, and those are, again, like similar to the LaPointe building. A small section of operable windows, but a large section of fixed glass to give as much light as possible. In this case, we have heavy timber framing spanning across out to the outside masonry walls. And if you compare that to the LaRosee building we were looking at, look at the spans are probably twice as big in each direction. The posts end up having to be 2 or 3 times larger too, because the loads that are being imposed on those are 18,000, 30,000 pounds at each post.
And the floors in this, you've got to go into Doug's bike shop, the floors are exquisite because they've sanded them, and they're just magnificent.
This is a view downstairs. It's a regular grid with some heavy timber posts on the bottom. Again, to give as much, what they were really striving for with these industrial buildings was to maximize the spans, to get as much clear space as possible. But when you stack up 2 floors, you can't really use a truss at the floor above your head, because that takes up a lot of space right there. So this was a good, probably cheaper means of getting a good compromise of span and open space. This is a great detail of like the heavy timber framing of what they would use for a column capital. That was a cast steel capital to take the loads from the heavy timbers. So typically nowadays you would expect to have these beams kind of locking into each other, but they gave plenty of room to be able to swing these beams in place. So there's a gap there, and this steel column is really transferring the load down to this wood beam, wood post. You don't quite see it here, but what they would do for fire safety, around the turn of the century, the late 1800s, they realized that if they cut or chamfered the edges, the corners of the timber posts, that would resist fire a bit longer than if they just had a sharp corner. It's what you see in a log. If there's like a narrow piece, it tends to catch on fire. So if they chamfered the edges of the posts, it would resist fire. A post like this, could go for 4 to 5 hours before it really would collapse. So it's interesting to compare that with steel. The same temperature steel that's exposed might collapse in 45 minutes or an hour.
Okay. We are essentially there. If we do the lights, we'd be happy to take questions if you have any. And it's perfectly okay if you don't.
Building on towers. What's the news on the building on towers?
We have none. I do know that the planning board said no. I think the applicant was looking for 275 sewer units. 270. And neighbors were up in arms. And I think they could have legitimately done 190 or something less than 200. And then I guess withdrew. What I understand. Don't know what the
last plan.
don't know what the plans are now. Marty?
They don't have it, but
Okay.
they said they're really going to look at it again. See what they can do.
What's in there now?
Empty, I think.
No, it's 2 or 3. Well, a little bit. There's offices in the middle, and then there's Fresh Start in the garage place.
Still?
toward the end.
Still, I thought Fresh Start was. Oh, okay, so they're going out.
And now in the back, there's a plastic molding and a machine shop. But the mill along the edge of the street was empty up until you get to the offices.
Okay. Yep.
2 floors. The bottom floor is a warehouse for the plastic molding.
Richard, what was the source of all this brick? Marlboro's building stuff out of brick. Where did it come by train, or was it built on site?
They say Boston is brick. We just happen to have a lot of clay that was easy to form, and that was the material that we had in this corner of the country. So by that time, early 1800s even, there were some brick kilns up in Maine, all through Massachusetts and New England. So it was, by the time these buildings were built, it was a matter of really just selecting which brick foundry you wanted to buy.
But did they drain them in, or
They,
toss a body, or?
yeah, they probably after the Civil War they had a full railroad network that they could place an order, and it would come by train. They still had to move, large shipments around a building, so that took a while. That was probably horses and carts getting it around until they had mechanized.
Like that, I couldn't understand that in Marlboro, because we've got all of Main Street is all brick buildings. But where do these people live? Is it like the pyramids of Egypt?
Good question, but before we leave the brick business, it brings up the idea of the railroads, because Tower Street is right adjacent to a track, which is long gone. I mean, the grade is there. They've taken the bridge off, and that was the Central Mass line. And when did that come through, Dave?
After the Fitchburg, just before the
That was later, 1880s, but that was still before LaPointe. But now for the other buildings, that was the Marlboro branch of the Fitchburg line, and that was, I'm going to say, 1855. That was very early, so that could easily have been brought in that way, very conveniently. And it's probably no accident that the Jefts building was wood. All the other 3 were brick, as you point out. Now, where did they live? Well, that's a good question. I suspect a lot of them for the mill building and for Jeffs lived across the street in the Water Street, Winter, Summer Street, Loring Street area. And some of these companies, not these particularly, but absolutely recruited a lot of the Portuguese just before World War I to come over and work in the rubber factory there. And I suspect a lot lived up around that too, but scattered around. But of course, in those days you walked.
Was brick cheaper?
Pardon?
It's a crazy question. Was brick cheaper than the lumber?
It was a certain number of things were starting to come into play with industries. You even saw it in Lowell very early, or Lawrence, where they had like the brick factories. The brick was able to span through the arches, but there was also protection, like a fire resistance with a brick. I mean, the heavy timbers were fine, but if there was really like an equipment explosion or something like that, the timbers would catch on fire, or mostly the floor planks would be the first things to catch on fire. So at least the shell of the building, if they were able to douse a fire, the shell of the building could get rebuilt fairly easy. Something like, a wood frame building with light framing would just go up in a minute. It would be impossible to catch up to it. So it was probably a form. There was some insurance pressure, I'm sure, to when they were first building to go in the way of using masonry on the outside walls.
A small brickyard still, and on our property, our original house was built with brick double ender, 2-inch height bricks, which is an antiquated convention for bricks, leading up to the question here. So I went into Hudson a couple of weeks ago to measure bricks downtown, brick heights. And there were 3 different heights. And so I was wondering how they made it one building to another with 2 stories of bricks that were slightly different heights, and they used different strategies. Do we know when the brick dimensions were standardized in New England?
I don't know the exact date, but my guess is it was in the 20s, somewhere around that time, where they started to have what they called modular brick. And if you happen to have a tape measure with you, a lot of times what I do is I'll count 3 courses of brick plus 1 joint. That should typically be 8 inches. If you look like at the town hall, for example, you'll notice the joints are very, very narrow. They use like a very soft mortar, and the bricks themselves were softer, clay. But at some point, I think it was in maybe even 1910, 1920, they devised a fairly standardized brick coursing of 3 courses plus an extra joint is 8 inches. And there's some variations from that now. You can get jumbo brick and things, but before that time, it was all over the place. You would have, trying to match things up would have been difficult if you were getting bricks from different foundries.
Well, one thing, a lot of the trade journals and trade executives from the 1880s, 1870s, 1890s are online now on archive.org. And you go in there and you can see that there were massive brickyards in, I think it was Charlestown, where it was like a whole mini city of brickyards that must have been feeding a lot of the factories.
One of the things when you were showing the factories, the columns holding up the ceiling and roof, after about 20 or 25 years, those columns literally petrified, so much so that you could not drive a nail into it. You would bed the nail, you'd destroy the nail, but you could not put a nail in it. Another little tidbit is LaPointe went out about 1972.
Yeah, give or take.
It was bought out by Stately.
Yeah.
Mr. Prindeville, who owned LaPointe, didn't want to close it down, so he sold it to Stately from England. Who owned Stately from England? Mr. Prindeville himself. That's how we got around not having to close down LaPointe. But during World War II, they had an expression, vital for the war effort. And some of the best machines produced in the United States came out of Hudson, Massachusetts. Wow. You know, around the clock, I think they employed between 1,400 and 1,600 people. And you could not, if you worked at LaPointe as a machinist, you could not be drafted because they could not afford to lose you. And they built machines that a lot of people thought that won World War II, right here in Hudson, Massachusetts.
They were called machine tools, which are machines that make other machines.
Right.
Yeah, the key. Okay, I think one more, and then we'll take it. Please.
LaRosee Building, tower. And I see towers on some of the other buildings, like Thomas Taylor. So you said that was for water tanks, for fire protection?
That image that you saw showed a water tank. And we weren't quite sure what the tower was used for after that. Same with the iFolds building. There was a tower there. We were trying to determine what the use was. That one may have had a water tank in it because I took a photo showing that there were the keys to open up valves at the base of the tower. So
There's one at Thomas Taylor, too, on the other side.
Right.
Seems like all those big buildings have a tower.
Right. Yeah, those probably the guaranteed water pressure that they needed. Sure.
I had the unfortunate experience of climbing up LaRosee's water to the top.
Yeah.
Don't recommend it. The pigeons have lived there for many years. And all I could think of was hantavirus or legionnaires and all this kind of stuff. So I went up real quick, snapped a couple of really quick pictures, and that was the end of that. But at any rate, thank you very much.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Grateful Historical Society, we
Oh.
do that.
Oh,
Small
okay.
token of our appreciation.
can we
Thank you.
retire?
Possibly.
On modest means.
To the LaRosee Building.
Thanks.
Fourth floor.
Thanks, Nick.
Eat all the squab you want.
Thank you.
Okay,
again.
well, we're around, so we'd be happy to chat.
With that said, this more or less concludes our evening. Our refreshment committee has been hard at work yesterday and today. The refreshments over there. I hope you all take the opportunity to go over there and have a bit of a social quarter of an hour. This is this is our first meeting of the year, to see how many people we have here due in no small part to the program we had tonight. Next month, we're going to have an equally interesting program, so it'll be gratifying beyond all get out to have this same